We must remember that South Sudan is a new nation. 2011, it only was formed. That's after intense negotiations in 2004 by the international community, ultimately because of a war that it was fighting with its neighbor, the North. Now, it would appear that since that fighting has finished, the rebel movements, the various factions who were united under a common goal to fight a then enemy, the North, have now turned upon themselves, seeing individual differences. And ultimately what you do find is that the president, Salva Kiir, and of course his former deputy, Mr. Machar, who are leaders of the two largest tribal groups, of which there's over 200 such groups that exist in South Sudan, are now disagreeing, unhappy with each other, do not trust one another, and ultimately what we're feeling is a spillover of that mistrust, that ill feeling between the two, and ultimately we are seeing the communities are now lashing at each other, and we're looking at potential civil war. Well, South Sudan is a slight sticky mess. Ultimately, it's a failure of leadership, but also a failure of weak governance structures that didn't exist, didn't have enough time, being a new nation of only 2 years, to materialize, and ultimately surrounded by corrupt politicians who do not see the bigger picture of their own communities, but ultimately trying to fill up their own personal pockets and ultimately their egos. I believe that South Sudan is going to find it very difficult in the short to medium time to be able to address its individual differences, simply because the politics in South Sudan is not mature, and of course a failure of the 2004 peace process is what we're having ultimately in terms of a blowback. Failure because we did not have enough reconciliation, we didn't have enough time for the communities and the population at large to heal from a very long conflict with its neighbor in the north, and of course the rebel movement that existed who were unified, many of them did not disarm. So we do have now ultimately many factions who have too many weapons on the ground, who are prepared to use it. And for those who are part of an army structure in South Sudan, many of them are ill-disciplined, poorly organized, and are prepared to vent their frustrations in the fashion we're seeing currently on our screens. Well, we have a bit of sectarian violence which has ensued, with youths going out with machetes, attacking one another. If you belong to the wrong ethnicity, you're more than likely to be chopped, attacked. You have very few choices, either to run, hide, or face those who are trying to attack you. To that extent, we have the UN buildings across the countries which are seeing a tsunami of people, literally angry, saddened, disappointed, disillusioned, and seeing no way back in terms of them going back to their communities. And ultimately, this would eventually impinge on the neighboring countries who, as we must say, those that surround the South Sudan, are very weak infrastructure services that they have, weak governance, and those governance structures will be stretched to the limit. Well, it was foreign intervention that led to a peace deal between North and South Sudan in 2004. It was foreign intervention that ensured that a peace deal was reached that led to both Sudan's North and South splitting and the new birth of South Sudan. Ultimately, it would have to be the international community, usually led by the Americans, if I must say, who were instrumental in that peace deal, to be able to try and pull back the pieces that are falling apart pretty quickly. Well, I'm afraid it's going to affect each and every one of us worldwide. You will see a curtail and a pullback in terms of production levels from the South Sudan, which would impinge on global world prices of oil. And ultimately, we would feel it at the pumps, irrespective of where you are in the world, when you go to fill up. So prices will go up, there will be panic in the markets, and of course, ultimately, the biggest losers will be the South Sudanese people, for which I must admit that many of those companies who are currently operational, which include the Chinese, the Malaysians, not to mention the Indians, many of them are either pulling out in terms of the personnel, slowing down production completely to a zilt, right down to zero, and ultimately leaving the country, which would only affect South Sudan's capabilities of raising much needed funds which they need for their infrastructure. But I think another loser will be North Sudan. As you do know, a lot of the oil pipelines run through the north, irrespective of the fact that the oils are predominantly found in the south. So the sharing of that wealth was both for north and south, and the north, who have nothing to do with this escalation of violence at all, will have to ultimately feel the pinch in terms of them not having the much needed revenue for their own economies. Well, I think the situation in South Sudan is slightly more tricky. You're dealing with a civil war that knows no bounds in terms of how long that would last. And of course, it has no determination as to how many people would lose their lives, not to mention those who will be displaced, and let alone the likely ensuing infrastructure that will be crumbling as we speak. So I think the situation in South Sudan is far more deeper, far more trickier for any international world player who would want to come and intervene right now. It's always a pleasure on RT.